Thank you, dear. I appreciate that. And I guess when people ask me who I am and what I do, I generally tell them I'm just an old country hardware store owner from Jennings. And there's a story about that. Before the big box stores, before any of those came along, we had a country hardware store. We took a lot of pride in the amount of money that we put in inventory. And we had a big inventory. And we had probably the biggest inventory of nuts and bolts in Southwest Louisiana, and took a lot of pride in that and invested a lot of money in it and hopefully made a little. But we kind of had a place we used to call the cave. It was under the second story, and that was all our nuts and bolts out there. And I walked through there one day, and there was an old Cajun, Mr. Fondo, who was a farmer, and he was standing there and he was looking at all that nuts and bolts. Now, not in the little drawers like you see today. These were in bins, and you could see them all. Wooden bins, homemade. And I said, Mr. Fondo, can I help you with something? He said, I need some bolts. He said, I'm building a barn and I need some bolts. I said, well, Mr. Fondo, what size do you need? And he said, well, I got a size in my mind, but it's smaller than that. So that may be somewhat the way the legislature operates. We have some things in our mind, but it's smaller than that. I'm not sure if it's our mind that's smaller than that, or if it's our plans that are smaller than that. So thank you for inviting me to be here today and speak with you. I'm certainly not the expert on education, but I have been drilled and grilled and taught over the last 3.5 years with some of our wonderful staff members, especially Jeannie Johnston and Cheryl Surrett, who have been with the education committees for a long time, and I've spent a lot of time with them and learning a lot, and it's been a great education for me. So I want to talk a little bit to you today about, and we talked about, Delia talked about the teacher pay raise. So I want to start and kind of take us through that process of how we get there and where we are in Louisiana. So the legislature doesn't really set education dollars. That's done at Bessie through a formula. It's not done by a resolution in the state, Senate, or House. It's done by a formula sent to us by Bessie. It's a constitutional issue. Bessie is given the authority to do that. Bessie sets the funding level for Louisiana's funding of education, secondary education. So the last several years, actually over the last 10 years, that formula hasn't changed a whole lot. It was raised in 2014 for the first time. It's at about $39,061 per student now, and under the proposal, it's going to go to $44,015, which is about a 1.375% increase. We currently spend about state money, about $4 billion. That's what this calculates to. It'll be a little bit more. That's $54 a student. That's about $39 million total. And that goes to the districts, to each one of the school districts in the states. So you can say to each parish or to each independent school district. So historically, over the past, prior to 10 years ago, the Bessie formula increased automatically by 2.75%. That went away in the previous administration. It no longer automatically raises 2.75%. It's done by Bessie, and if Bessie can calculate in a 2.75, send it to the legislature, we can either do two things in the legislature. We take that formula and we put it into a resolution, and the legislature can do two things with it. We can approve it, or we can send it back to Bessie with recommendations of what we would like to see in there. So we can recommend to Bessie. And that's what happened. That's what has happened at this point. Let me tell you a little bit more. I'll get back to that. But we've also included in the MFP formula, or Bessie has, is the teacher pay raise. That's about $100 million. And that teacher pay raise is $1,000 for each certificated teacher in the state, and $500 for support personnel. That's $101 million. And then the $39 million is for the 1.375 increase that goes to each one of the school districts. So what's happened is there was a resolution in the House that put that formula into the resolution. There's also a resolution in the Senate that I'm carrying that has that same formula. They're identical. The House Committee on Education has sent a letter back to the Bessie Board asking that they take the $39 million out, which is the 1.35% increase to the districts. They have left the pay raise for teachers in. That's the $1,000 and the $500 for support personnel. But they've asked Bessie to take the 1.375 out. Bessie is meeting, I believe, on May the 7th to make a decision as to what they're going to do. If they're going, Bessie can do several things. They can do nothing, which means the last expression of the Bessie Board is that resolution that's sitting in the House and the Senate. They can send us back the exact same thing that they sent us before, or they can change it and do either what the House Committee has requested, or they can change it to whatever they feel like is the right thing to do. So they can change it, or they can send it back the way it is. I guess there's really two things they can do. I'm not sure what Bessie's inclination is. I have an idea that they're going to do one or two. I think they're either not going to act, or they're going to send us back the exact same thing that they sent us before. I don't want to speak for Bessie. They have an opportunity to discuss that and make their decision on their own. I believe, however they send it back, the teacher pay raise will be in it. I think, though, that the education community, teachers included, and all of the districts believe that the 1.375 is extremely important. And they think we're going forward with a plan or with a program, and this is the first step. We all know, I think everyone in this room, every one of my constituents that I talk to, and all of the legislatures realize that $1,000 and a $500 pay raise is not a lot of money by the time taxes and whatnot are taken out over a period of a year. We know it's not enough. Does it get us up in this southern regional average for teachers? It certainly keeps us from falling down. And we haven't had a teacher pay raise or a support personnel pay raise in 10 years. We've only had increases to the districts once in 14, a small increase. So they look at this as a package. So, and I think the controversial issue is the 1.375. Let me also step back and talk about the legislative process. Constitution says that resolution has to be sent back to Bessie and acted on by the legislature. It has only been acted on by the House Committee, not by the legislature. So those resolutions are both still sitting there, one in the Senate, one in the House. The House chamber could call that resolution tomorrow or today from the committee if they chose to do so. They haven't acted, so I would say, in my opinion, the House has acted, the Senate has not, and which means the legislature has not acted. If Bessie sends us a different formula, those resolutions have to be amended to the new formula, because we can't act on that one because it would be the last expression of Bessie. So we're now waiting on a May 7th meeting of Bessie to see what they will send back to the legislature. I think the 1.375 is something that's very important to talk about. There are those who think that we need to take that 1.375 and use it for other things other than increases in the minimum foundation program to our school districts. I tend to believe differently. I think our local school districts are very, very important. Now, you will have some folks who tell you that if you take the total amount of spending, that it's about $12,000 per student. That's total amount. That's everything from the state, the local, and the feds. The state is only $3.8 billion. It'll be about $4 billion if we do this increase. So if you look at other states, when you look at the state portion, we're actually a little bit lower. And there's a caveat to that. We do something a little bit different in Louisiana. In Louisiana, there's an unfunded accrued liability for our retirement systems. Of that 4,000 that we propose to send and to raise that per pupil, 30% of that automatically goes to pay the unfunded accrued liability. So we got to take 30% out of that $4,000 before you can ever spend it in the classroom. Other states don't do that. Some do, but most of them, the state pays it. And that is an obligation of the state. In Louisiana, we put it in the MFP, we send it to the districts pay their portion, and what's left is what's available to educate students, along with whatever local taxes and federal money they have. So we need to be very careful when we're comparing state to state. We need to look at total means of finance, and that's federal, local, and state. So when we look at that, Louisiana's about in the middle. So we don't overfund secondary education, and I don't believe we underfund it. But that's where we are, and the last results that I have are actually for some 2016. If we don't do something, especially with teacher pay and with increases, other states are increasing their teacher pay and increasing their amount of dollars to education. We fall in that ranking. And the last thing Louisiana needs is to be last in something else. We have an opportunity here to be about in the middle and remain in the middle, which I think is very important. When you look at the 1.375 increase, I think if you go around and talk to districts, many teachers have told me that their districts, especially districts that are in somewhat of good condition financially, have said if we get the 1.375 increase, we may take a portion of that, add it to our local money, and increase your $1,000. That's a great opportunity for teachers, especially in districts who have managed their money very well or have been fortunate enough to have a very, very good tax base. We talked about the UAL. The other thing that we don't do in Louisiana that some other states have is a capital cost fund. We don't build any school buildings in Louisiana. In some states, a portion of their funding goes to capital cost. Not all of it, but in some states there's a capital fund where you actual fund school buildings. We don't do that. That's all local. The locals have to pay for that, and they have to pay for it predominantly from their local funds, because the funds that they get through the MFP have to be spent 70% in classroom instruction materials, which includes pays for teachers. The other thing that local districts have is mandates, unfunded mandates, from both the legislature and the Department of Education. For instance, now we mandate that all testing has to be done on a computer. Someone has to pay for those computers. Someone has to pay for those programs to have that testing done. That has to come out of that portion of those students, of the student per pupil amount. We have new state standards that we adopted 2 years ago. Teachers have to be trained for those new state standards. And all of that training and all of that curriculum material has to come out of that additional money, or that money hopefully would be additional with the 1.375. We also know that we live in a high poverty state, and high poverty education costs more than general education. And so once again, districts are picking up that tab. We have insurance. Insurance, I know everyone in this room, your insurance has gone up. So has the insurance, whether it's health insurance or property and casualty insurance or workman's compensation insurance. It's all gone up, and it's gone up in your school systems, and they haven't had an increase in 10 years. And I know all of ours have gone up in the last 10 years. Of course, retirement benefits have gone up. We continue to work on those. I will say that in the pay raise of the $100 million that's proposed, both insurance and retirement benefits are paid for and picked up by the state. That is a very, very good thing for our local districts. Something else that bothers me a lot we have to spend a lot of money on, and it's all local, no state, is security. There's a big new issue out there of security in our schools. We're having people break into schools and kill people. We have to be very aware of that, and we have to be able to secure our schools and secure them safely for our students and our teachers. And that's being done at the local level. And so that's an added expense that they didn't have 3 or 4 years ago. It wasn't on the radar, and it's on the radar today. Consequently, I think it's extremely important that 1.375 increase be included in the Bessie formula to bring back to the districts so that we can not only give a modest pay raise, but that we can also have money to either match pay raises or take care of all of those other issues that come with running a school system. I don't believe that Louisiana overspends in secondary education. I think secondary education is extremely important, and we should step up to the plate and fund it. And even though I could make an argument for the 2.75, I'll be satisfied with the 1.375. So that's kind of an overall view of the MFP. Where do I think it's going to go? It depends on that May 7th vote of Bessie. And I think if Bessie, whatever their vote, whatever their decision is, what they send back to the legislature, and I believe it's going to be exactly as the first one they said, because I believe the Bessie board sees how extremely important that is. And they see, and the teachers see, and administrations see that the pay raise and the 1.375% are tied together to enhance secondary education in Louisiana. So I really believe that's where we need to be, where I hope that we will move in that direction. The $39 million has been mentioned to be used in a lot of other areas. I believe we can find other areas, and the worst thing I think we can do is pit education issues against other education issues. It's our responsibility to step up to the plate and fund secondary education, which, by the way, is K to 12. LA4, which are our 4-year-olds, are not in the minimum foundation program. It's primarily paid for by the $1 billion I talked about that we get from the feds and from local school districts. That's one I left off on my list. LA4, which is a very, very important program, started under Governor Foster and actually really got a push from former Superintendent Cecil Picard. Always envisioned that it would be in the MFP. It's not. Still isn't. And we're not fully funding LA4. We're doing pretty good, but we're not fully funding LA4. So once again, I think another reason that we should step up to the plate, make it part of a plan to where possibly next year, if revenues permit, we can give another small teacher pay raise and get that moving to where our teachers are not going to be at the bottom, not going to be at the top, but at least maintain that level of being in the middle. And I'm going to quit. I haven't looked at the time, so I don't know what the normal procedure is, but I can talk a whole lot more, but I think it's best, instead of me talking to you, that we talk together. Teachers we already have an accountability program. So if you don't meet that accountability, that wherewithal, or that program, then you're going to be put into in need of improvement, etc. That already exists. So is there an indirect tie? Yes. Is there a direct tie? No. Now, what has been suggested early on was that we have an additional money for, say, science or math teachers. Say, if you're a science teacher, you'll get $1,200 instead of $1,000. I think then we're doing what we talked about earlier. We're pitting teachers, certificated teachers against certificated teachers. That doesn't work. But I tell you what, it does work. It works for an argument for the 1.375%. because if a school district needs a math teacher, they have the ability to take that additional 1.375% and use that to go and use it as a carrot to get that math teacher to come into their district. For those districts that don't need additional teachers or don't need additional certificated teachers in that particular area, then they can use it where they need it. It gives the districts a lot more flexibility.
Was there any particular reasoning? Was there any reasoning from the House as to why they are requesting Bessie to revise their formula?
And the question is, were there any reasoning from the House committee, House Education Committee, on why they didn't like the Bessie formula? They want the $39 million in appropriations is the answer that I can give you to that. They have talked about putting that additional $39 million into early childhood education. Yes, that's been spoken of. I don't know that they certainly didn't put it in the letter to Bessie. The letter to Bessie just said they would like to have the teacher pay raise move forward and the $39 million taken out. There was talk in the committee of using that for early childhood education. That early childhood is very, very important. As a matter of fact, I'm beginning to recognize how much more important that is in this state than what we don't even fund LA4. So I guess my position there is let's take one step at a time, and I'm not even sure if, and I'm gonna say this publicly, I'm not even sure if we're ready for the $39 million in early childhood. Remember, early childhood education is essentially today childcare. There is some of an education component, and it's also not public, it's private. It's not inside of the MFP, just like LA4. Should it be? Probably at some point, yes. Should we fund early childhood? Absolutely. At the expense of K to 12? I don't think so. I think we have an opportunity, and I'm not a sit interim on finance, and I said on appropriations when I was in the House, I believe we will see, from some of the work that we did last year, I believe we will see more revenue available to the state. And as I see the Appropriations Committee today, combing through every nickel and dime that every state agency is getting, I believe they're going to find the money there to fund what is needed, or a portion of what's needed in early childhood areas. And I just think for us to pit education issues against education issues is not the right thing to do. I believe, let me take that a step further. Similar to ITEP, I had a constituent ask me the other day about that, and he was very opposed to ITEP, and I asked him, I said, well, what about your exemption? He said, I don't get an exemption. I said, you get a $75,000 exemption off of your home. He's for ITEP now. But nevertheless, we have one of the highest homestead exemptions in the nation. So that limits, and by the way, that's granted to the people by the legislature, but the legislature doesn't have a property tax, only the local school districts. So it's very similar to ITEP. So I'm going to answer your question. I don't think anybody ought to get 100%. I don't think any industry should get 100%, and in most states, they don't. I think what has been proposed, I think what Governor Edwards' proposal was the 20%, and then the issue of allowing the school board, the sheriff, and the local police jury to make a decision. The problem that I saw was there was no consistent method for the three entities in the parishes to decide how that was going to work. It was a big problem in Calcasieu. You know, each one of those entities was able to decide whether they wanted to grant the ITEP or not, but there was no consistency and not a lot of public input into the decision-making process. So that part I think we need to fix. As far as it going back into the state and letting the state make that whole decision, I certainly think they need to be part of it. I don't think that Jeff Davis Parish has the wherewithal, has the resources to look at these projects, whereas the Department of Economic Development probably does. So there should be some dialogue between those parishes and the Department of Economic Development as to what is this really going to produce for our parish, so that they can have good information when they make those decisions. But I do support letting local input be part of it, and I don't think anyone should get 100%.
One more question. This is sort of.
I can't hear you, John.
I said one more question. This is sort of on specifics you mentioned. You talked about the money being funded to give I guess this is what you said, every child a computer. Is that funded by the local, or is that part of MFP? And is that actually what you're saying, is every child have a computer in the local school system?
John has asked if, when I talked about funding earlier and the requirements that all the tests have to be taken on a computer, was I saying that every child would have a computer? No, that's not what I'm saying. There may be a bank of computers in a testing room where the student can go and test. Should every child have a computer? I will tell you that I have a grandchild in Minnesota. He has a computer he brings home every night that was provided to him by the school. So is it probably the future? Absolutely. How is it paid for? It's paid for predominantly, the MFP money, 70% of which has to go to classroom, curriculum and instruction. Computers can be bought through that 70%. They can be bought through the additional 30%, and they can be funded with the local tax base also. All of those are paid for with a combination of monies. And I believe today our IT in Louisiana is pretty good. We did that 2 years ago when we did a study to look at where we were. There's only about 3 school districts in Louisiana that are way behind the curve. Most of them are actually getting there, or have some. We've actually, the Department of Education, the governor's office, spent some time with these districts to come in and look at where they are. And of course, as you know, IT changes every day. But we've done a pretty decent job of funding that.